Bienvenidos. My name is Victor Ugarte. I'm the director of the Instituto Cervantes in London. Welcome to our guest speakers today, Sebastián Balfour, Hispanist and historian, Alison Ribeiro de Meneses, and our chair, Sarah Wright, Hispanist, professor, and president of the Association of Hispanists of Great Britain and Ireland, one of the partners of this series called Spain 50 Years from Dictatorship to Democracy. The other partners are CERU SRUK, Society of Spanish Researchers, Romancero Books, The Garden Cinema, and the British Spanish Society. It's both an honor and a privilege to welcome you to this evening's reflection on Spain's remarkable journey, 50 years from dictatorship to democracy. Tonight marks the third installment of our five-part series, Franco before the Civil War and the Memory of Francoism in Contemporary Spain. These are the two talks today. Yes, yesterday we had the pleasure of hearing Sir Paul Preston in conversation with Richard Baxell at the Garden Cinema, a passionate and thought-provoking exchange that set the tone beautifully for what we are exploring together. The series takes us from the shadows of Franco's authoritarian rule to the vibrant, pluralistic society that Spain is today. It's a transformation that speaks to resilience, reconciliation, and enduring strength of democratic values. So, as we gather here, let's not only look back, let's also reflect on what this journey teaches us about the importance of strong institutions, the role of civil society, and the need to protect our freedoms for generations to come. We have in this series, on the 20th of November, the anniversary of Franco's death, we have the talk called Political and Cultural Transformation After the Transition with Duncan Wheeler and Nuria Capdevila Argüelles. The 25th of November, we have Queer Legacies of Francoism by Moisés Fernández Cano, Daniela Fernández Pérez, and Victor Ramírez. The 9th of December, we have Madrid 63 Years On with the Reuters correspondent Jules Stewart. You can find more information about this program in our website, of course. We have also other events these days, like the Echoes Festival, the classical music from Latin America and the Caribbean. And next Monday, we have William Chislett talking with Michael Portillo in a sold-out event at the Spanish Embassy. And on Monday 17th, again in the Garden Cinema, we have the screening of Rojo Clavel, Red Carnation, a documentary based on the life of queer flamenco dancer Manuel Liñar. Thank you very much, and just give the floor to Sarah Wright to introduce our speakers. Gracias.
So thank you, Victor, and thank you, Jorge, and also thank you very much to our two speakers today for making this very important event happen. It's marking 50 years since the transition to democracy in Spain, and it's fantastic to see so much interest in this topic today. So thank you very much. So I'm going to introduce the two speakers. I'm going to give them biographies, first of all, for both of them. And then we're going to invite Sebastián to come and speak. And then we're going to invite Alison to come and speak. And then we will have a round table, which I will kick off with some questions. And then we'll open up to the floor. So hopefully that will all go brilliantly. So it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Professors Sebastián Balfour and Alison Ribeiro de Meneses. Professor Sebastián Balfour is Professor Emeritus at the London School of Economics, where, amongst other roles, he was Assistant Director of the Cañada Blanch Centre for Contemporary Spanish Studies and Senior Fellow of the Castellan Observatory. His research focuses on contemporary Spanish history, the consequences of the collapse of the Spanish Empire in 1898, the colonial war in Morocco 1909 to 27, and the first deployment of chemical weapons against civilians between 1924 to 27 in northern Morocco. He has also studied popular movements of protest during the Franco dictatorship and the transition to democracy. He's a specialist in contemporary Spanish politics, including social and political protest in Spain. He's also an expert in Catalan nationalism and the independence movement. Another area of expertise is the political career of Fidel Castro, although I don't think he's going to touch on that today. The Cuban Revolution and contemporary Cuban politics. He's the author of numerous books, including Dictatorship, Workers and the City, Labour in Greater Barcelona since 1939, which was published in 1989, Castro from 1990, The End of the Spanish Empire 1898 to 1923 from 97, Deadly Embrace, Morocco and the Road to the Spanish Civil War from 2002, The Politics of Contemporary Spain 2004, and The Reinvention of Spain, Nation and Identity Since Democracy from 2007. And he's also written an enormously long list of academic articles. He's appeared on numerous media outlets in Spain, UK, Europe and beyond, and has worked closely with the Museo de Historia de Barcelona to co-curate an exhibition on the Franco's project of authoritarian modernization and its consequences. He's also received an award from the Moroccan Association of Memory of the Rif in recognition of his work on the colonial war in northern Morocco in the 1920s. And today he's going to speak to us about Franco and the forging of an interventionist army. Professor Ribeiro de Menezes is a Hispanist at the University of Warwick with particular interests in literature and film, and she's a specialist in the links between history, memory and culture in various regions of the Hispanic world. She also has interests in Portuguese narrative and film. Her books include Juan Goiti Solo, the author as Dissident from 2005, A Companion to Carmen Martín Gaite from 2008, and in the field of memory studies, she's published the co-edited War and Memory in Contemporary Spain with Roberta Quantz and Anne Walsh from 2009, and Legacies of War and Dictatorship in Contemporary Spain, Portugal and Spain with Catherine O'Leary from 2011. Her monograph, Embodying Memory in Contemporary Spain, was published in 2014. She's also published a co-edited special issue of the Bulletin of Hispanic Studies on the future of memory in Spain in 2017, and a co-edited book, Public Humanities and the Spanish Civil War, and also, so it's a very long list for both of you, the Bloomsbury Handbook to the Spanish Civil War in 2023. Her major virtual Spanish Civil War project is a collaborative project funded by Canada to create a virtual resource of exhibits and entries from the Spanish Civil War. She's also published numerous academic articles and she's given lectures around the world. She's extended her work in memory studies to Latin America and has developed research on conflict transformation in Colombia, and on Chilean exiles and the World University Service with Professor John King in collaboration with Warwick University and the Museo de la Memoria in Chile. She's also run AHRC grants on British responses to refugees from Chile, a project which brought together oral histories and the study of emotions to map humanitarian support through artistic responses, including physical theatre. And she's currently writing a monograph on transnational memories of the disappeared, exploring the ways in which memory debates in national or regional contexts intersect with others. And today she's going to talk to us about legacies of Francoism and memory in contemporary Spain. We're going to start, I think, with Sebastian.
Right. Well, what can I say after that introduction? Many thanks indeed for introducing me so flatteringly. I must say, I'm supposed to be speaking just for 20 minutes, but this is a great challenge because I'm going to be covering a lot of space of Franco since he was posted to Morocco to the Civil War and beyond. I'm afraid I will be making some reference to the Civil War. There's another challenge. I don't know who you all are, so there could be experts here who will say to me, no, it wasn't that year at all. Or, worse than that, I disagree entirely with your interpretation. And this will take up all our time. Well, let's hope that's not the case and you'll be generous with my interpretations. I will argue that Franco spent most of his formative years in his career as an officer in the colonial war in Morocco. He was posted there in 1912, and between 1919 and 1926, he fought in the War of the Rif. The War of the Rif, which is often not mentioned, was a struggle for the independence of an area, of the Berber area of Morocco, against both Morocco, Spain, and France. And out of this war, what this war did was to help forge an army of Africa, as it was called, that played a decisive role, which I shall argue, in the defeat of the Republic in the Civil War. Oh, I'm sorry, yes. I assume that I have a microphone here, which might, no, but I'm happy to do so, because I'm old, and this is the old style of. Yeah, okay, fine.
I'm old too, and I've got hearing aids.
Okay, thank you.
That'll be lovely.
So, let us go to the first map. Yes. For those of you not familiar with the, actually,
Let me text.
oh, I see. There's something there. Yeah.
Sorry.
It's all right.
Don't be bound by 20 minutes. Just keep going.
Okay. Well, it depends what you think of what I say. Oh, good. Thank you. Right. Yes, here we see I don't think we need to go into much detail. Am I right in thinking that the protectorate of Spain in Morocco, I think you probably know the background to that. Anyway, it was set up in 1912. It had been in the Treaty of Algeciras, it had been nominated as a zone of influence for Spain. Okay. Franco was posted at least 11 years. In other words, he stayed apart from visiting Spain occasionally, he stayed there 11 years. His connection with Morocco was for at least 11 years. And the connection, during that period, he commanded the Regulares, the Moroccan mercenaries, and the Spanish Legion. And not just that, he was posted elsewhere, but he was posted with detachments of the Regulares and detachment. That was in 1917 when he was sent to put down the rail strike in Oviedo. And in 1934, when he commanded both Regulares and the Legion in putting down the Asturian miners' strike. And I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. So an almost unbroken relationship with Moroccan soldiers and the Legion between 1912, and if you consider that he was in command of the Army of Africa, it would be 1912 to 1939. So this is a very close attachment that he had. And for Franco, the importance of that experience was expressed in a statement he made, which is quite unusual for him to make such a clear statement, because he was always ambiguous and reticent about talking about himself, unless in glorious terms. What he said was, this is a speech I think he made in 1939, but nevertheless, forget when that speech was made, but it was made in that period. My years in Africa, he says, live with me with indescribable force. Without Africa, I can scarcely explain myself to myself, nor can I explain myself properly to my comrades in arms. Now, I've got to explain, Africa is Morocco in the language of the time. But another sign that that Morocco played an important role comes from Carmen Polo, his wife, who said, and this was actually earlier than that, 1929, she said one of his major defects is he likes Africa too much. Indeed, if you think about how deeply his identity with Morocco, how deeply it was embedded, that in the post-war period he appointed his faithful, closely related Moroccan mercenaries as the Guardia Mora, his personal bodyguard. And that when Morocco became independent in 1956, he renamed this guard, which remained his personal bodyguard, the Guardia Franco. Yes, but why? What was so important about the colonial war? Well, I think it shaped his concepts of war. It shaped his understanding of command and hierarchy. And he saw the army as an arbiter of Spain's political destiny. And he acquired a deep alienation from the metropolis. What in particular? Well, obviously the restoration system he would have disliked as a military person with ambitions. The restoration system, which I'm sure you all know about, it was before the Republic of 1931. The restoration system was a system characterized by fraud, corruption, and the dominance of the caciques, the local elites. And the second thing that led him to feel alienated from Spain, from the metropolis, was the Republic of 1931. That abolished the monarchy, and that was for Franco a fundamental expression of Spain's identity. And when he was in command of the Moroccan Regulares against the Asturian miners, he himself talked about this being a frontier war. Now, it's a very strange expression. We're talking about Asturias, and Asturias was the launch pad for the reconquest of Spain in 711. And he's talking about a frontier war as if the miners were Arabs and the Regulares were the Spanish patriots. So it's a very strange view, but it does show how embedded his identity as a African or a Spanish leader of African and Legion troops. It also, of course, that alienation also had its roots in professional questions. Medals and promotions through military action, as opposed to those promotions and pay rises offered to officers based in mainland garrisons, whose rise was dictated by purely seniority according to a closed system of pay and promotion. The critics of the Army of Africa, based presumably amongst the officers in the garrison, was that they got promotion and medals through the wounds they achieved. So and this might have been directed against Franco, in that Franco always attempted to post himself, or to get himself posted to those detachments like the Regulares, like the Legion, who saw most action. And of course, Franco himself got a wound in his stomach in 1916. Okay. Now, I want to look perhaps at the Regulares. We will see them again, of course, but here, if we go to the next. Here's a detachment of Regulares in the colonial war. I haven't been able. Detachment. Look at the T. It's
Next line.
right. I haven't been able to identify the year of this. And the next one. Well, let us perhaps talk about this. Okay. The Regulares were mainly local Moroccan mercenaries from both the French protectorate and the Spanish protectorate. On the other hand, the other element of the Army of Africa were the Legión Española. And you'll see here, I get confused because I'm seeing the next slide. Here's Franco and Millán Astray singing the Legion theme song, the Novio de la Muerte, the Bridegroom of Death. It was created in 1920, the Legión Española, created in 1920 with Franco as second in command, consisting of Spanish mercenaries, some of whom had served time in jail, and this was a way of getting out and finding some wages, and foreign mercenaries as well, some of whom were veterans of the First World War, and therefore quite combative with experience of war. And indeed, in that period, in 1920, the Legion was steeped in the ideology of the extreme right, extolling heroic death like the title of what actually was the official anthem, but not official either. It was the one that they all sang because it was, the tune was much better than the official one. And this is, on the right, you see Millán Astray, who is the commander, appointed the commander, who had been campaigning for the establishment of a legion, was, I think a lot of people will agree, including Paul Preston, that he was a bit of a nutter. Together, these forces were the core of the Army of Africa. And what they did was to import brutality and efficiency into the Civil War, which they had learnt in the colonial war. Yet, 15 years before this, before the insurrection of 1936, the Army of Africa, or indeed the colonial army, could not be talked of as an interventionist army, as I mentioned there. The army, according to a French military intelligence report that I've seen, talked about the Army of Africa or the colonial army as being actually two armies. And this is important to understand in relation to the civil war that occurs afterwards. First of all, you had as we know, the Foreign Legion, the Regulares, and indeed the police of the Sultanate. the Mahalas. And then you have what was, strictly speaking, a metropolitan army. Spanish officers serving a short period unwillingly in Morocco in the colonial war, risking their lives, because they had been unable to avoid military service. And soldiers, just ordinary soldiers doing military service, from poor families, many of them illiterate, they were fighting for a cause they couldn't identify with. Spanish protectorate, what does that mean to people with very little idea of international relations, or indeed very little idea of Spanish interests? And they weren't properly fed or properly clothed. They were wearing espadrille. They were wearing ponchos in winter in the mountains of the Rif, which is very cold in winter. And their training was completely inadequate, and they were poorly paid. So this was not an army of occupation or an army fighting against rebellious tribes of the Rif. And here we see the stone marking the place of death of Silvestre, because what happened in 1921 in the Battle of Anouilh was that Abdelkrim, whom you can actually see, oh no, it's me who have to see it, not you, where finally the resistance in the Rif against the penetration of Spanish capital, railways that were taking away the iron ore and other valuable materials from the mountains of the Rif. Anouilh happened when Abdelkrim, who I will quickly switch to for the moment, Abdelkrim managed to forge an alliance between some of the tribes of the Rif in an effort to, or in a cause of independence for what he declared as a new republic of the Rif, against the Sultanate. So not just against the Spain, but also against France eventually, and against Morocco, the state of Morocco. Let me go back to, this was where the general leading a particular large detachment of troops further into the Rif, in a not a very clever way, I won't go into any more details of that, was set on by this new alliance of soldiers from the Rif, and massacred he and all the other outposts around the area. And indeed, some of the regulares who were posted there with Silvestre left and joined the Rif fighters. So it was an absolute disaster. They carried out a massacres, because they were in different places, different parts of this big detachment. They also, I just forgot what I was going to say, of up to 12,000 soldiers. Now this we can see in the next. A relief column that came to help or to discover what had happened came to Monterruit in the same year, 1921, and found what was reported widely in Spain, but what was shocking to contemporaries of the time, the atrocities committed by the Riffi fighters. Atrocities including, taking out entrails, cutting off noses, cutting off ears, cutting off heads. And these were, of course, by the time, as you can see, one or two, well, there's only one officer there holding his nose, but by the time they arrived at the place, the corpses were rotting. There were even, may I say it, barbed wire stakes pushed up people's bums. A soldier remembers how they were enveloped in a dark mood and unable to sing anymore. So this gives some sense of how deeply this affected the Spanish soldiers that they came across. And the soldiers that came to relieve the troops, unable to because they were all dead, destroyed the nearby orchards and tried to kill anybody they could come across. Burnt down the deserted villages as well. So you can see a change in atmosphere of the war. And I actually was able to speak with one of those 100-year-old man. Well, he was 100 years old when I interviewed him a long time ago. Pau Masferrer Fontanella, a veteran of the relief of the General Silvestre's army, and he arrived just 2 months after the disaster, so was able to see still some of the remains of the bodies. And the disaster transformed the meaning of war, of colonial war, for both the Spanish military and for civilians in Spain. And the driving force of retaliation, backed briefly by Spanish public opinion, became revenge against the Riffians in the rebel territory. So Spanish soldiers started to indulge themselves in rape, in looting, killing prisoners, severing heads as trophies, which they would hold up for the Spanish press to photograph. Also bombing villages and markets. And that Franco approved of these methods is clear from his book Diario de una Bandera, when he's already in the Legion. And there was another atrocity which has been kept, I wouldn't say quiet, but certainly something which both the Spanish state or the Spanish parliament and Morocco, the state of Morocco, has not wanted to discuss, but which has done the most damage, and not just immediately after the colonial war, but including now. It is doing damage now, and that is the chemical weapons. As I say, it's not been allowed to be discussed at all in the Spanish parliament. Chemical weapons that the Spanish Air Force used had been tried out during the First World War. It was anything from chlorine gas to mustard gas. Don't forget that the Versailles Treaty of 1919 had banned the use of chemicals. And the Geneva Protocol of 1925 also led to, it was an agreement between the major powers not to use not to use mustard gas or any other form of gas. And this was agreed by all signatories. Spain, not surprisingly, agreed only in 1929 when the colonial war had ended. The main producer of mustard gas in particular, is the most noxious, was Germany. And the king, who is very interested in modern weapons, was the one who made major efforts to get Spanish envoys to agree with the German producer during the First World War. Obviously, he was not producing any still, but he had reserves of that. And an agreement was reached with the Spanish government and the military to send mustard gas to Spain and Morocco. And the target was now civilians, not soldiers. And the method used to use mustard gas was by plane. So this is the first time, because the First World War was all these different noxious chemicals were used against soldiers, number one, and two, fired by mortar bombs. So not by air. And I want to show you the example of one here. This is somebody that I photographed, interviewed, who was descendant of a family that were bombed with mustard gas to terrifying effects. His elder sisters, his mother, not himself, but he was tiny at the time. And what this is, because I've seen this actual carousel, this type of carousel in a Spanish aircraft museum, what the pilot did, these were 10-kilo bombs of mustard gas, so something that could be manipulated by the pilot. What they did was to throw bombs, 10-kilo bombs, on their victims, which would be people in villages, people in individual houses, like this guy here. And what they did was to take this and hide it before the Spanish army arrived, because the Spanish army scoured, after the end of the Civil War, scoured the whole area, all the villages and the markets and so on, to look for any evidence of the use of chemical weapons. And they hid this because they wanted to keep this as a record of that bombing. Now, mustard gas is a liquid vesicant, if you know this term, which burns and blinds, attacks nerve cells, it causes TB, it pollutes the water and the vegetables, because what the Spanish Air Force did was to go for water supplies. It went for cattle as well, to destroy the means of living of the Riffians. And perhaps the worst thing of all is that it's what is called mutagenic, in that it transforms the genome of its victims, and it gives them epigenetic and teratogenetic effects. Teratogenetic means it causes it's the descendants of the people. It gives them deformities, and mutagenic or epigenetic gives them cancer. So this is the case now in Morocco, and in those who've migrated or emigrated elsewhere. Huge spread of cancer which, well, can we say it's related to this bombing? I think we have to say that what I'm showing you here is it comes from a Rabat hospital, the only hospital in Morocco at the time that I was there, which specializes in childhood cancer. And this hospital produced its own chart of the children with cancer who were treated in the hospital. Now, you mustn't forget that Morocco didn't have a national service. So the children from the RIF in this hospital, their parents had to be able to afford to take them there and to pay for treatment. So the 49% that you see here from the north, that's where obviously the Spanish protectorate is, the RIF is, far greater than the other percentages. And I was able to trace this a bit in the military archive in Madrid when I was looking for details of mustard gas bombing or just generally chemical bombing, and all the reports of the bombs used to bomb villages and souks and rivers and so on. The reports were in code, so I couldn't decipher. It could have been TNT used in particular villages, and not mustard gas. But then finally I came across a report which went more or less as follows, a report from the commander-in-chief to his field commanders, and it said, I'm fed, I didn't know exactly, not the right word, not the exact words, I'm fed up with having to remind you the code of these bombs. Here it is, learn it off by heart and destroy this document. And there it was, in the military archive. So from that I was able to then reconstruct, able to see the villages that had been hit by that rather than TNT, and so on and so forth. So I got a sense of the enormous quantity of mustard gas that was dropped on people and cattle and all the rest of it, and the date of the bombing and the quantity of the bombs. So 10 kilos, 20 kilos, 50 kilos, which was more for a souk, because 50 kilos would create greater damage. Now, you may ask, okay, so 5 minutes, okay. Well, perhaps I won't talk about the proof, or perhaps not proof, something awkward to find out whether the chemical arms were used in the Civil War. I don't really have time to talk about that, but certainly the records seem to suggest that Hitler and Mussolini supplied chemical weapons, in particular mustard gas, to Franco. Other brutalities of the colonial war, which were imported into the Civil War by the Regulares and the Legion. Well, there was looting, there was rape, killing prisoners, replaced by summary trials leading to mass executions and mass unmarked graves. You'll be familiar with this. Spain is covered with unmarked graves, very few of which have been dug up, despite various acts of parliament. Okay, and I just want you to see one final person that I interviewed. This is this was the deathbed of El-Haj Mohammed Mouawesh, veteran regular. Now, he fought for both Abdelkrim and Franco. You may ask, why? Because, he'd been the recipient of atrocities, or at least perhaps didn't affect him personally. Why? And I think this makes us understand more the condition in which the Riffians lived, and perhaps still live too. Well, in 1936, when the Civil War began, the Riffians had suffered 2 years of drought. They also had lost jobs because the closures after the uprising of 1936 in North Morocco. And then serving under Franco, who was their great enemy previously, serving under Franco meant that they had at least wages for very poor areas. And some of them, and looting too, which was a source of revenue. And then there was attachment, those who had served with the colonial officers in the Regulares. There was attachment to the old Spanish officers. I won't go on more about that. So just to end, I think we can say that Franco played a very important role in creating the interventionist and brutalized army, but not just Franco, many of his co-officers also in the colonial war. But obviously there are other keys to success of the military rebellion leading to the Civil War. We have to talk about German and Italian planes who played a vital role in bringing the Army of Africa over to fight in the Civil War. Don't forget, the conspirators of 1936, just to show they weren't particularly efficient, assigned a purely passive role to the Army of Africa because they didn't see a way of bringing the Army of Africa over to fight in the Civil War, because the Navy was pro-Republican and the Air Force, the Spanish Air Force, did not have sufficient planes available to do this air ferry across the Straits of Gibraltar. So the German planes, the German troops, the German arms, with Britain and France non-intervening, that played a fundamental role in the balance of forces, because when the insurrection took place, the pro-Republican forces, depending on where they were actually at any one moment, and the pro-Francoist forces were equally balanced. So what played, I think, a fundamental role in the victory of the Francoists, we call them now Francoists, was the Army of Africa, with its enormous experience in vicious fighting and atrocity and so on, and the German and Italian planes and tanks and troops in some case. Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So I want to begin by thanking, first of all, the director of the Instituto de Cervantes, Vitor Ugarte, for this invitation to speak and the opportunity, for Sarah for her kind words of introduction, and of course to Sebastian for me joining the panel with you, as it were, and following on. It is an honor to speak on a topic that I realized in preparing my notes I've been thinking about for rather longer than I had honestly registered in my mind. So I started my own doctoral research about Guardi Solo over 30 years ago, back when we didn't really use the term memory as it has come to mean or to be prevalent in Spanish culture and literature today. But that's what I was interested in, the resistance to the dictatorship and the way in which Juan Goytisolo in particular, but also other writers, would use and try and shape their work as a means of demystifying, was the word we used then, the way in which Spanish history was used and read under the dictatorship. And it's about 20 years ago, almost exactly, when I started to think about writing a book on memory in Spain, which had then started to emerge in civic debate. And that would eventually be the book that Sarah mentioned, that came out in 2014, embodying memory in contemporary Spain. It's a rapidly changing subject. And like Sebastian, I had the same problem in terms of thinking about audience today as he had. Some of you will know an awful lot more about this, perhaps, and follow this more closely than even I'm able to do, because it's constantly changing. Others may not be so familiar. So I hope I'm not going to fall between the two stools here today. But I'd like to begin just very briefly by saying, what do I mean by memory? And to say that for me, as an academic working in the field of memory studies, that is what I would say briefly is the meaning of the past for us in the present, and also how we use it to shape our future. So it's very different in a sense from the formal profession of history, which it's sometimes confused with. And I'm interested in that sense of what the past means for us now in the present. In Spain in particular, the word memory has become particularly associated with one set or group of memories from the Civil War, and particularly in the term memoria histórica, historical memory. But what I'd like to point out, or to think about, going back to my own early work, is that memory didn't begin in Spain in 2000, as is often thought, with that emergence of memoria histórica. Memory has always existed. We didn't necessarily think about it or term it that way. But the memory of the war, the Civil War in particular, even began during the war. The way in which it was used and shaped and instrumentalized, of course, dates to just after the events. And that continued under the dictatorship. This is perhaps not often thought about so much in the popular or general civic debates about memory, but of course it's well known in academic discussions. As Sebastian, I think, mentioned, maybe it was earlier rather than in your talk, but we were talking about the way in which the Spanish Civil War was highly mediatized. It was one of the first wars that actually, through people like Robert Capa, of course, was covered in that modern sense. And that also meant that it was a war whose story was being shaped by propaganda, what my collaborators on the Virtual Museum that Sarah mentioned talk about in terms of public history. And I'm thinking about events such as the relief of the Alcázar of Toledo, which was then restaged so that photographs could be taken, and a myth of rebel heroism could be forged. And the memory of the Franco regime is, of course, enshrined in its monuments above all else, as well as its celebrations. Early on, you can point quite easily, for instance, to the monument at Paracuellos del Jarama and the atrocity there. So the cemetery of the martyrs, where 2,500 were murdered by Republicans, and that was celebrated well under the regime, becoming a symbol of Republican crimes during the war. Later, that would be usurped by a monument that many of you will perhaps know well, the Valle de los Caídos, or now called the Valle de Cuelgamuros, inaugurated in 1959 on the 20th anniversary of the end of the war. Or I could point to the Arco de la Victoria, just to pull another one out, at Ciudad Universitaria in Madrid, which was inaugurated, well, it wasn't actually inaugurated, sorry, which was finished in 1956 on the 20th anniversary of the outbreak of the war. So memory in this period is a form of new nation building, and it began with and immediately after the war. And I don't have a PowerPoint, but I have a couple of props thanks to the librarian upstairs, because I mentioned to her that I was going to simply refer to some novels on the topic. So she handed me the copies, out just recently, if you are interested. And winner of the Premio Nacional this year is Paco Cerda's Presentes, which is a novel that narrates the transfer of the remains of José Antonio Primo de Rivera from Alicante to El Escorial. And of course, the date of the 20th of November is the date of his death, but also the date of the beginning of that transfer in 1939. And what Cerda does is take the 11 days of that journey and juxtapose it, with those people whose stories had perhaps been forgotten, and real stories. He looks for real stories, what we might call microhistory or everyday history, and the stories of those people. And so behind the transfer of that myth-making moment of the removal of José Antonio to the Escorial, you have the stories of those who were represaliados, repressed, tortured, shot, disappeared, exiled, and left to work in the work camps of the regime. And so you have this juxtaposition as a form of telling the wider story of the memory. And one of the things that actually strikes me about this book that I was quite surprised is that Cerda uses the word memoria histórica for that period rather than assuming it refers to the present. So he talks about this memoria histórica de la muerte and uses that phrase to take it back. I think reminding perhaps the wider public that memoria histórica isn't just a particular set of memories for one group of people, but in fact is a question that we can think about and debate from different angles. What Sebastian showed us very clearly is the reason why we need a redress, and that is that for many years, of course, the dominant memory of the Civil War, its meaning and the legitimacy of the regime that was founded through its victory was the one memory that was acceptable in public and official space. And it is the imposition of that memory and the huge silences that it left in the public and civic domain that has had enormous consequences for the development of memory and dealing with the past during the transition and after the transition, if you believe that it's ended, which there's a debate about, do transitions end and what does that actually mean? I'm not going to talk a great deal about the transition because I know you have another session on that. Duncan Wheeler will talk about that. And it is, of course, true that the memory of the war changed during the dictatorship and changed during the transition. But looking back even on the recent television series that RTVE has done, or the earlier one that they did, it's very clear that in cultural terms, the words and the kind of the trigger ideas that were still used right at the end of the dictatorship are very similar to what I have sketched out now in terms of the meaning of the war for the regime, even at the end. What has changed, and much of the work that I have then looked at in the cultural domain, has been the question of those exhumations that have been going on since 2000. The first one was in 2000 in terms of the current wave. And I'd like to say a little bit about that. So if cultural memory emerges in Spain in the late 1990s, that is due to a number of factors, of course, partly the aging of the war generation, partly the interest in a number of writers in family stories and a turn to family fiction. And so that allows me to present the other two books I wanted to mention. One's only available digitally in the Cervantes Library, Josefina Aldecoa's Historia de una Maestra from 1990, so very early in terms of memory, but also Manuel Rivas, in Spanish here, El Lápiz del Carpintero, from 1998. And what works like that show us are the beginning of the emergence of those silenced family stories and traces within the home, within the domain of the family, of that repressed past that was not given expression during the dictatorship or given any recognition in the public domain. It is from this that I think the current memory movement has emerged, from gaps in the family tree, from photos of unfamiliar faces that younger generations don't know who that is, but there's a person on the wall. Because, of course, the family photos that we put on the walls in our homes are the people we're related to. But if you don't know who that is, that immediately asks the question about who is that? And this is the story of Emilio Silva, who founded the Association for the Recuperation of Historical Memory. It's the story of very many third and fourth generation Spaniards who began to ask, who is that? Why am I called Emilio in his case? What is the story here? So within that case, if those memories survived and were able to be transmitted, it was from the family that they emerged out, that you can see this in the literature. The other context, of course, is human rights, which was emerging as a framework in a transnational context. And the enormous impetus given by the attempted extradition of the Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet in 1998. He was detained here in London, as you probably know, with an attempted extradition by Balthasar Garzón, leading to wrangling. But the question that, of course, is raised is, well, if Spain is extraditing a Chilean dictator for crimes against Spaniards under the Chilean dictatorship, what about our own? And this does bring the question of human rights language and idiom into to Spain's memory debates. And in 2000, Emilio Silva, to return to him, writes an article that I think we can probably use to date the beginning of the current memory movement. On the 8th of October 2000, in the Crónica de León, he publishes an article that says, Mi abuelo también fue un desaparecido. My grandfather was also disappeared. And it's this use of the word desaparecido, disappeared, the connection to Southern Cone dictatorship memory and legacies, that starts to ask a further question of what is being done about the exhumations of the mass graves that are mentioned, but also the legacy of the street names that still remain, the various monuments that are still there, the symbols and iconography within the nation. And so the beginning of a questioning about these issues starts around that time. It's probably also worth saying that it was felt democratically safer in a sense. Spain had had 25 years of changes of government without any particular sense of instability. That means there was space, and memory isn't always something that there is time or space to talk about. And this was a moment where things came together and worked. There had been exhumations in the early years of the transition. There's been some excellent work done by an academic called Zoe de Kerengat on those. They were not done formally. They didn't follow the protocols of forensic science. And of course, there had even been earlier exhumations done officially, unsanctioned by the regime, which Miriam Sacca has called cuerpos nación, so the sense of the forming of the nation through the exhumation and reburial of the dead, of which José Antonio's burial is the classic, I think, example that we can point to. But the main wave of exhumations has started, and we are talking here about the exhumations of victims of rearguard repression mostly, from 2000, and it remains ongoing. Those would lead to questions when, in one particular case, a man called Fausto Canales in 2003, looking for his grandfather, found that there was just bone fragments left in what they thought was the mass grave. And when he followed the documents, that was when it began to emerge that there had been exhumations of the war dead to the Valle de los Caídos under the regime. And so the question of that monument has become something of a hot topic and a difficult past to be dealt with at the moment. What I would say, just to finish off this little section, if you like, about that early wave of memory, is that in the broader question of transitional justice and memory studies, Spain falls interestingly between the European context and the Latin American context. In the European context, there's been a great deal of talk about sites of memory, about locations where particular things happened. Memorials of camps such as Auschwitz, of course, is the iconic example. Whereas in Argentina, immediately after the dictatorship, and later in Chile, of course, the focus was on the missing bodies, the bodies of the disappeared. And Spain is a little bit between these two. So I think you have, and that's why I called my book Embodying Memory, you have a question of an embodied memory politics in Spain that is very strong. Even though, of course, we have also had the changes of street names that have occurred across the landscape, the removal of monuments, and so on. So it's actually for an academic, a very interesting case, if I can indulge myself and say that here. What's going on today? This is where it's very hard to keep track. We have, of course, had legislation, the Law of Historical Memory in 2007, the Law of Democratic Memory in 2022. And through that, I think we've seen an increasing, slow but increasing state commitment to these processes of memory. But this remains a highly politicized and difficult question, and there are no easy answers, I would also want to suggest. The majority of the memory movement has been the result of bottom-up civic processes, frequently supported at regional level by certain political parties, and then at times defunded, if I can borrow that American term, by others. And so what we have, of course, at the moment is a little bit of a battle of the legislation, where laws of memory are being replaced with laws of concordia or concord, as it were. And what this, I think, shows that when we start to think about what the past means for us, language becomes a very slippy question that we need to think about what we mean by the words that we're actually using. I mean, some of the most eye-catching events are probably the removal of Franco from the Valle de los Caídos, which when I set out 20 years ago, I didn't think was something that would happen. And I've talked to people like Francisco Fernández, who's been involved in a lot of the exhumations and who's involved in looking at how to deal with that monument. And he didn't think it would happen either. We've also had the removal of José Antonio there. There are attempts to challenge the narratives of the past through the Fundación Franco. This is the latest in the news, I think last week. But what we also have are ongoing exhumations at a regional level, which are facing the challenge of trying to manage the hopes and expectations of relatives, even when a mass grave is opened, because there is no national DNA database that exists, from what I've been told by people working in the area. But there is also a utopian expectation that DNA will bring answers. And after so many years, it doesn't necessarily. So the expected identification rate might be 10 to 15%. And that is very difficult for families who are seeking truth and who want an answer to have to deal with. There are, of course, ongoing problems of interpretation. My colleagues Antonio Cazorla Sanchez and Adrian Schubert write a great deal about this in some of the publications we've done together. And they talk about the divisions over issues such as blame for the war, which I think many of you will be able to talk about much more than me. The problem of moral equivalence. Who is to blame but both sides? Do we equate atrocities? How do we deal with those particular questions? Victim hierarchies are also a very prevalent problem. And these are not just unique to Spain, they're unique to countries dealing with the sort of legacy of a dictatorship. And to do these also, of course, in the context of culture wars, if I can borrow that phrase, makes this all the more difficult. I was asked, speaking recently in Valencia, about this. So what do we do? And that's a pretty challenging question. I sometimes wonder if we shouldn't go back to the oppositional literature under the regime, which was very interested, someone like Goytisolo, in trying to disentangle the myths of the regime, but without creating their own. We need the sort of narrative subtlety and complexity that is able to think about those kinds of questions. More broadly, the 1977 amnesty law remains a problem in transitional justice terms. And I think we probably need to consider a better public history, a more complex and subtle version of public history, recognizing that the public history tradition that you have in Europe after World War II comes as a response of that particular victory, the victory of the democracies, as it were, and that the situation that Spain has gone through is much more difficult because of the legacies that I have tried to set out. So it becomes extremely difficult and yet pressing to consider how we educate about the past, but how we do it in a way where people can arrive at their own judgments based on fair and grounded information. That's perhaps the key question. how do we engage the younger generations? Because, again, talking to people from the memory movement, they've suggested there's no one younger coming in. We're doing this work, but how do we galvanize and keep the story being told? So, how do we do that imaginatively and effectively so that they understand the importance of this for democracy going forward? It's a little bit because of that, that with the colleagues in Canada that Sarah mentioned, that we have set up a virtual museum of the Spanish Civil War. There is no museum, as you know, although there are efforts to make one. And what we have tried to put online is a resource that, at least written by, we try not to be too dry, but we are academics, that has factually informed information that people can consult in a digestible manner and online on phones. And we have, and this is the piece of it I'm most excited about and that I find most interesting, we have within that, of course, galleries, the origins of the war, the progress of the war, daily life at the front. There's a memory section. But we have an open gallery where people can send in a photo, an object, a document, and explain to us and put up in their text what that means to them and why. And the reason that I think this is important is because we begin to get the stories that were hidden and silenced. Not the narrative of academics and historians, that's important. Not the narrative legacy and arguments about the past, but someone saying, this is a picture, I wondered why it was there, and now I understand who this person is, and that's why it matters to me. And so, in a sense, trying to understand how memory works within the fabric of communities might be a way forward. I can't say we've got the answer, but at least we're trying to make an effort amongst the many, many digital resources that exist about the war. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to thank both speakers for absolutely wonderful and really engaging talks. Thank you so much. Sebastian, you told us about these atrocities that had happened with the Moroccan Wars, and it's so fascinating to think. I'm sure there's so much more you could say about the links between those wars and what happened in the Spanish Civil War, and the sort of legacies there. And then you've really brought out in such a graphic way those legacies onto the Moroccans themselves through chemical warfare. So that's absolutely fascinating. And Alison, thank you for showing us really vividly how important these questions are and how they're so ongoing and something that we should be engaging with. So thank you so much. I'm going to start by asking you both two questions about silences and about the future of memory. And then I'm going to open up to the floor because I'm sure loads of people have got lots of questions. So first of all, to Sebastian, if that's possible. So I'd like to ask both my questions first, if that's all right. I want to ask you a bit more about this question of these colonial wars that are so understudied and underacknowledged, and how we can make sense of that in terms of public memory and understanding of public history in Spain. That's a silence there that's just, can that be overcome? How can we kind of deal with that question? And to Alison, I'd like you to tell me a bit more about your virtual museum. If it's not too embarrassing to ask, why isn't there a Museo de la Memoria in Spain the way there is in Chile, for instance? And then to both of you, I'd like to pose Alison's question about young people. So how can we engage young people in these questions so that they become interesting for them? Virtual questions.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I feel what is missing in the whole debate about the colonial war and the Civil War and its link is that on both parts of Morocco, Spain and France, it is seen as a separate war. That is to say, it is part of a national narrative, and there is absolutely no talk about Morocco itself and the people of the Rif. The Rif remains, as a result of the defeat of the Republic of the Rif, it remains a very poor area without any infrastructure, without any human rights, because it was directed against Morocco in the first place. And then it is seen by the French as being their part of a colonial war, and the Spanish as being their part of the colonial war, and not something which was a third world struggle for independence and for development, which was the objective of Abd el-Krim. Let us not forget, Abd el-Krim was a collaborator with the Spanish for a while. He was a collaborated because he hoped that this would, the Spanish presence and their opening up of the mines and their bringing in railways would lead to the modernization of his area. And that's often forgotten. In other words, the account of the War of the Rif became immediately, in the account given by both French, Spanish, and Morocco, fragmented, a war concerning only the colonial powers. So that, I think, is one area that needs to be developed. But of course, it is subject to the discrimination against the Rifis. That's one thought. How to involve young people? I tried very hard, and young people wants to involve the youth of the Rif. And I tried to start a movement in the Rif. I've been there a lot, and I was at meetings and so on and so forth. A small group of people, of young people, to start collecting the narratives of individual families, of individuals, and so on and so forth. And this was, we're talking here about 20 years ago. And I understand that it's still the case now. They were too frightened to do that. Too frightened because the Moroccan police would investigate them if they tried to do that. In my case, I was able to go into the countryside. I was able to interview veterans. I was able to interview families and so on. But the people who accompanied me said, two of them are doctors, Moroccan doctors, who said, you won't see any police because they know you're a foreigner. And they're not going to interfere because they don't want their reputation to be sullied. If we try to go and see families, we're in trouble with our jobs as well. So this is a reflection of the quite punitive approach by the Moroccan state about the past. And let me just add one final anecdote. What's happened to Abd el-Krim? Well, the present king described the Abd el-Krim as a Moroccan patriot, but he wasn't at all. He wanted an independent Rif. So this shows the complexities and also the dominance of international issues.
Yeah, thank you. It's absolutely fascinating. It seems so many challenges on both sides, in fact, for this part of history to be acknowledged. Yeah, thank you. I'm going to pass to Alison.
Okay, thank you. Why is there no museum of the Civil War, let alone a museum of memory, which would be a separate, perhaps, thing? I think that's probably not a question for me to answer. What perhaps shapes this is the fact that, and this is simply a reflection on the process, the route that these memory debates have followed in Spain. They have come bottom up. They haven't been national top down. And that's a key point, I think, which differs from the case of, say, Argentina or Chile, where you have a rupture in Argentina with the end of the dictatorship, the end of the Falklands Malvinas War, and so on, which brings about a redress of the past. It's somewhat different, as you know very well, in Chile, where you have a slower process. And so the Museum of Memory in Santiago was only founded in 2010, very recent. But in both these cases, these are top-down government controlled and designed mechanisms. Whereas in Spain, much of the memory movement has come from the bottom. That has given it strength because that means that it can work, it can duck and dive in different contexts, but it gives it a weakness in the sense that it can't work nationally to the same extent. So I think the cases of the Southern Cone, say, versus Spain, they're moving in opposite directions, and that might explain why there is no museum per se, because you need a huge amount of money and investment. There is a projected museum at Teruel, which should open in 2028, if I'm right. Whether it will just be about the Batalla del Ebro or whether it will be broader is a question. It's beset by the political question. To then have a memory museum, I think, would be a question of how you deal at a state level with the notion of memory. And whilst we have a particular model, say, that might come from Germany with the Holocaust, the route that Spain has taken is quite different, and I think that's probably why we don't have one. I don't know that you necessarily have to have a museum of memory. That just having a museum doesn't mean you have a reflective context about the past and the various silences, dominances, and the narratives that do and don't get heard. So I wouldn't want to fetishize a museum, but I think that's the difference.
Can I just add one
Please.
one thing? There is a memory, the Museo de Gandesa,
Yes, there is.
but that is a local. Well, it's looking at the Ebro offensive,
Absolutely.
and it brings together. But next to it, next to that museum, which tries to talk about the Civil War as a whole, is also the ruined village bombed by the nationalists. And that is nearby, and that is deliberately left in its ruined state, Belchite.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there's an effort to have a proper museum at Belchite as well.
Right.
But these are all small. There's no national, and when I say new museum, I mean no national museum. You're absolutely right. There are a lot of very small bottom-up initiatives.
Yeah.
Museologists might wonder about the contextualization of some of those, if I can put it that way.
Yeah.
But that's not to say they don't exist. Absolutely, you're quite right. In terms of your second question, engaging youth, that's really difficult.
I think you raised it as.
I did, I know, and I was asked it, and we sat for an hour in Valencia talking about this in an event on memory last week. So I don't necessarily have the answers, but it did strike me, and that's why I brought the Paco Cerla. It did strike me that telling the everyday stories might actually be a way of not looking for a single homogeneous narrative, but allowing complexity to emerge and to interact, and that perhaps that's what we need to think about. And that what we might do is try and tell those everyday stories in a community setting and see if that would work. Education is obvious as well, and work should be done in that regard. But I think we can't put people off by simply telling them, you must now go and do this. I think we need to interest them in the story and interest them emotionally in the implications or consequences of what happened.
Yes, there's also been quite a lot of work done by the creators of that documentary, El Silencio de Otros, The Silence of Others, Carracedo and Baja, who have, I do some work with the BFI, we do schools workshops, and they have been very, very generous in giving their time, to talking to young people in this country. So yeah, it's been fantastic to see that as well.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you. I'm gonna open this up to the floor, I think, and we do have microphones, don't we? Yeah.
Thank you. This is a question for Professor Balfour. When you brought out so vividly Franco's feeling of alienation from the mainland, speaking of himself as an outsider and even as an African, made me think at once, of course, of other famous nationalists like Napoleon, Hitler, Bismarck, Hitler and Stalin, who weren't from, as it were, the center. And my question is, did being an outsider, as Franco thought of himself, did it help or hurt, or neither, his very rapid but quite far ascent from regional commander to caudillo? Did it help? I think it wasn't relevant, actually, in the sense that the Army of Africa had its own rules. Army of Africa had its own procedures for promotion and so on, ones that were regarded as, in Spain, the army was regarded as retrograde, as based on old protocols, so on. Whereas the Army of Africa was portrayed by the press, above all, as being a heroic army. Franco himself was, by 1926, when he was became a general, these were regarded as the future by a lot of the right-wing press as the future of Spain. So there was always that reference to Franco being heroic, Spanish, typically Spanish, and so on and so forth. So it was very much his own. So he was thought of as an insider, that he sort of presented himself as outside. As an outsider, yes. Well, I don't say he promoted himself as an outsider. He was always very cautious to maintain a good reputation. But his more internal view was, as an outsider, not liking the system in Spain, wanting to change it. So it was an argument for fundamental change.
Thank you to Sebastian and to Alison. Alison mentioned the need for redress after 37 years of Francoist propaganda about the glorious uprising and the crusade for Spain. And I'm wondering whether, particularly in the last 20 years, the pendulum hasn't swung too far on the opposite direction, to the point where sometimes the narratives presented nowadays is that Spain was a wonderful democracy until some wicked generals decided to give a coup, which triggered a civil war. And there is a reluctance also to consider the counterfactual. If the Republic had won the war, how likely is it that Spain would have become a Western-style democracy or a Stalinist republic? And I think we owe it to independent thinkers such as George Orwell to dispel any rosy conceptions of the Republic. And if I may add, what should be done for young people to feel engaged? I would suggest removing ideology and politics from the history.
Yeah, sure. I didn't mention the Second Republic, but it's, I think, a mistake to compare the democracy of the Second Republic on equal terms with the democracy that Spain has today. It was a very, very different situation, a very, very different regime. Or I think one way one can look at this is to say that not everyone who fought for the Republic was a Democrat, but all the Democrats fought for the Republic and started that particular position, which I think is one way of thinking about it. Whether the pendulum has swung or not, I don't think it's for me to say as a non-Spaniard what Spain should do or think. I can reflect as a memory studies scholar comparing across what other countries have done. It is true that memory is highly politicized it is absolutely highly politicized on all sides. And that, I think, is a difficulty. So one of the things I have said to people on both sides is, how do we build a bridge? And I was amazed that they didn't necessarily think that we might go there. And I say this as someone who grew up in Northern Ireland during the Troubles, so I'm coming at this from that angle. And I think much of the work and the way I think about memory is informed from that experience. So these are very difficult issues, and we do need to admit that they're politicized. How we find a way around that is perhaps a sense of generosity and openness to listening, and that is a question that I think each person in Spain needs to judge where that falls and what that should be like. So I'm not going to sort of judge on either side, particularly on that, because I don't think it's my place as a non-Spaniard. But I would say that there is, and I'll just finish with this, there's a phrase in the... Oh, is that me? The Ulster Museum in Belfast, which says, we have a shared history and different memories. And I think that's a useful starting point for those kinds of questions.
Yes.
Word up is Pastor else.
So
I just wondered whether, thinking about young people's involvement and so on, whether you know how these issues, the Civil War, dictatorship, historical memory, are dealt with within the education system by the state, whether it's covered or not covered, or how they deal with these issues.
My understanding is not greatly, but you might
No, I think you should be answering this question rather than me.
thought you might. My understanding is that it's patchy, and that rather like the world I grew up in, where Irish history wasn't talked about in Northern Ireland schools, it's only recently that people have looked at this. But again, the curriculum is subject to one's particular position, and therefore it becomes a very difficult issue to talk about. So what I think, and any of you who know the Spanish curriculum will know much better than me, my understanding is the Civil War comes at the end, and sometimes they just don't get there. That's what actually happens. And that's, I suppose, what we would call an Irish solution to an Irish problem. But anyway, enough of Ireland. Yeah.
Simon. Oh. Anyway, Sebastian, you paint a picture of Franco as somebody who was probably fired by the fact that the Republican movement, Republic took place in whatever it was that the king abdicated. But for that what put him into a fury. And that set this march on, not so much, I'm trying not to use the word fascist, but as an Africanista, using his army, because once it had been taken by Mussolini and Hitler's transports into southern Spain, he treated the opposition in the same way that he did the Moroccans in the Rif. They were slaughtered. Anybody who opposed him was massacred, etc. And this went on right the way up to finally when he conquered all of Spain, and including Catalonia and the Basque Country, and the suppression of Catalanism and the Basque language, etc. This went all the way through. And I want to sort of now leap to the present day, because we are coming up to the 50th anniversary of his death later this month. How much of that feeling that Franco had then still exists today, now whether it's through Vox or whatever, because certainly the idea of Catalan nationalism is not in their favor. Sanchez is decried for allying himself in order to achieve a majority in government. This kind of attitude that started off in the 1930s, etc., despite the fact that the monarchy has been restored, but is that still very much part of the Spanish right-wing psyche?
Yes,
A lot of question.
yes, I think it is. I think it is through Vox movement, which is reflecting the sense that Franco was a hero and brought progress to Spain. And that rests a lot on the myth, if you like, that he was personally responsible for the modernization that occurred in Spain in the 1960s. Whereas this, of course, the origin was the Opus Dei movement, who were modernizers within a non-democratic regime. I don't know if this answers your question at all, but certainly,
A comment there, just short it around these things, because I went to
yes,
a recent meeting and it was referred to Franco actually paved the way to democracy, which I thought
yeah. Well, that's
pushing it a bit far.
yes, that certainly is going much too far. Franco was certainly not. Franco had to negotiate with his teams. He wasn't responsible solely for appointing the Opus Dei, for example. The Catholic Church had a lot of say in that development of a modernizing movement in Spain. But certainly, I think what Vox is reflecting is not a return to any fascism so much as a return to, or not a return, but to reflection of the anger felt by people because of low wages, poor living standards, and so on and so forth. I think it is, Vox is a right-wing populist movement that is picking up those kind of grievances, which are not about the past, but about the present situation of many poor people in Spain who are obviously outside the nationalist regions.
I'd been given a signal. Have we got time for one more? Or should we? We've got time for one more, and then we're going to adjourn for wine. I think.
I just want to share a thought on this, which I've shared with Sebastian previously. I'm his wife, by the way. It's about the memory thing and poor people in these countries, like in Morocco, and their fear of the police and all of that. There are enormous immigrant populations here and all over Europe, of course, of Moroccans. I'm just curious about how we can encourage younger Moroccans, for example, in London, to learn about these things and discuss it and decide. I mean, we live in North Kensington, an enormous Moroccan community there. I used to work in community education. I used to work with the Moroccans long before we discussed any of this. And I mean, I'm just wondering, are there any people who are Moroccan who are here tonight? Anybody? No.
No.
So as an educational institution, maybe there could be workshops and things with Moroccan community, because when they're abroad, perhaps they will be less frightened of police. I don't know. I mean, I'm not an academic, and there is an enormous gap between the elite academics who discuss these matters and the people out there whose ancestors have suffered so much. That's just my thought.
Thank you. Did you want to?
No, I don't. I can't. I wouldn't dare. Yes.
Okay, well, I think we will leave it there in that case. I would like to thank both of our speakers for amazing talks, and also to everybody in the room and for your participation and generosity with your questions. Thank you so much. Thank you.